Would you join me, please, in welcoming Bishop E.W. Jackson?
Yes, please take your seats. Thank you so much. Before I say anything else, I have got to acknowledge my wife of 47 years, Theodora Jackson. Now, I am on an unofficial leave of absence from my church, and I'm in someone else's church most Sundays these days. And my wife said, well, I want to stay most of the time at our church and be there. Pastor Jason is my executive minister, and he is helping to provide leadership. But I'll tell you all something. I told her, I said, you've got to be here tonight. I've got to get you here tonight. And she said, I'll be there. So she jumped on a van with some of my church members and came down. So thank you so much, darling. I'm glad to see you. Thank you. Because we've already been gone several days on the campaign trail. I also want to thank Noel, because Noel helped me pull this together. And thank you so much, Noel. I appreciate it. Campaign manager, Brittany Ross. Thank you, Brittany, for all the leadership that you provided to the campaign. And I want to thank all of you for your prayers, because I really believe this, that these efforts are sustained by prayer more than anything else. I just had one of the reporters ask me about the amount of money we raise, and I pointed out that when you don't hold office, you don't raise as much money. Just the reality of it. When you hold office, you raise more money because people are more willing to give to someone who is already in office for various reasons. Some good, maybe some not so good. But we are doing just fine because grassroots people are giving their $5 and their $10 and their $25 and their $50. And I want to thank every single one of you who is helping us. Well, I like to get to the assignment that God has given me, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming tonight, and I don't want to hold you here all evening, but this is an important moment. I'm here tonight not just because this is the 50th anniversary, this month is. He was actually assassinated on April 4th, but this is the 50th anniversary of the death of Dr. King. That is important. And I'm here in part for that reason. And nor am I though just here because this is the city where in August of last year we had a major conflagration that was covered by international news. Probably very few people from the Charlottesville, Albemarle area involved in it, but nevertheless, it was covered heavily by the news. And I just felt that it was time to deal with a burden that is on my heart. I've asked God for two things before I leave this earth, at least these two. One is to help me be a part of calling my country back to the values that made us the greatest nation on earth. Amen. To come back to those values. And the second is to help me to be a part of bringing us together across racial and cultural lines and ending the racial divide that has plagued this country for the last 242 years. And I believe we're going to bring it to an end. So I'm here with a burden tonight. I pastor a little church, and we have a mixed congregation. We have a lot of black folks in our church. And we have youth church every Sunday. And it's my privilege when I'm there to call the young people up to the altar to dismiss them to go to youth church. and I look at them, and I see such potential. I see such God-given ability. I see so much in them. And then I think that they will probably hear, as they're growing up, that they can't make it, that people won't let them because of the color of their skin, and that they should not expect too much because they're black, and that America's a racist country, and white supremacy governs our nation, and this, that, and the other. And if they allow it to happen, they will be dumbed down into expecting very little of themselves and into, in fact, hating their country because of it. And my brothers and sisters, not on my watch. I am not going to allow that. For those of you who know my background, I'm a foster child. I was put in foster care when I was 18 months old. Was in foster care until the age of 10 years old. My foster parents were semi-literate. The foster father, Willie Millette, could not read at all or write at all. My foster mother, Rebecca Millette, could read and write a little bit, but not much. And they had very, very little. He was a sandblaster, she was a homemaker. And they had very, very little. I saw my father from time to time. He stopped by and visited with me, but he was a welder in Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. I did not come from wealth. I did not come from privilege. Some of you have heard me know that I am the great-grandson of Gabriel and Eliza Jackson. They were slaves and sharecroppers in Orange County, Virginia, not, 40 miles from this place where we're standing right now. My great-grandparents lived. My grandfather was born there. So you are looking at a great-grandson of slaves, and you are looking at a former foster child, but I'm here to tell you that America is the greatest nation on earth, because no matter where you come from, you can become something in this life. Now, one of the reasons I fell in love with Dr. King was that he was not preaching division. Right. He was not preaching hatred. In fact, you know, this is fascinating to me, but at some of the worst and most violent moments and attacks on him, he used to say, "We're going to wear you down with love." Now that's something, isn't it? For a person to say, "We're going to wear you down with love." And it never left me. While others were following Malcolm X, I was following Dr. King. While others were hanging on his words, I was hanging on the words of Dr. King, because they spoke to my heart. And yes, Jason's already quoted those words. He said he longed for the day, he dreamed of the day when our children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But you know, he also said that he wanted us to be a nation of brotherhood. He wanted us to come together. That was his dream. His dream was the beloved community. Not the community at each other's throats. Not the community pointing fingers and accusing one another. And I want to share with you my thoughts about where we are today versus where Dr. King wanted us to go. I was 16 years old when Dr. King was assassinated. 50 years later, 72% of black children are born out of wedlock. 50 years later, our children are graduating from high school functionally illiterate to the tune of 85% of black males graduate from school functionally illiterate. 50 years later, more black people die at the hands of other black people every single year than died in the whole lynching era and the heyday of the KKK. 50 years later, nearly half the black community lives in poverty. Now, we've heard for the last 2 years that black lives matter. Yes, they do, because all life matters. But if black lives really matter, why don't we start working on rebuilding the family instead of trying to tear people apart? Why don't we start doing something to create jobs and make these communities safer? Why don't we start providing parental choice in education? We've got 88 non-accredited schools in Virginia. Most of those schools are being attended by black and minority children. Why don't we give those parents an ability to send their children to a school that will actually educate them if those black lives really matter? I think Dr. King would be deeply dismayed. I really do. I think he would be deeply dismayed at what is going on in our country today. I think he would acknowledge that race is really no longer a matter of trying to solve a social problem. It's a matter of using it as a political weapon. That is now used to shut people down and shut people up and stop people from having any kind of discussion about solving problems. So it's thrown around now like a weapon. Everything is racialized. Everything is a matter of race. I heard one state senator in California say that it is clear that the policies of the Trump administration, particularly the Attorney General's administration, his department, are based on white supremacy. And I'm thinking, well, where? How? But then I realized it doesn't matter, because throwing the accusation out is enough. You smear people with it. You marginalize people with it. You slander people with it. And there don't have to be any facts behind it whatsoever. I think Dr. King would be dismayed by that. I think that Dr. King would be dismayed by the fact that while everything is racialized, on the other hand, the scourge of abortion that is committed in our country, particularly among black women, is somehow not racial. 13% of the population is black. 37% of the abortions are performed on black women. Planned Parenthood plants itself in or near black communities and makes itself readily available to minority children. I think he would be dismayed by the fact that you're not allowed to say that that was Margaret Sanger's vision, that she had a racist vision. She wanted the populations of black and minority children and those she considered to be feeble-minded to be suppressed, and she was trying to figure out a way to do that. Eugenics didn't quite work because it wasn't very saleable. But she finally came up with something. She called it Planned Parenthood, but it's actually Planned Death. And it is exactly what she intended, that black women are having their children aborted in such large numbers, and they had the nerve to put her bust in the civil rights display of the National Portrait Gallery. And I led a group of people up there to say, no, that's out of order. She should not be here. She should not be here. I think he would be dismayed that a brilliant young lady like Candace Owens, who says, I don't want to be anybody's victim. I don't want to be treated like a victim. Why would anybody want that? Would be so viciously attacked because she doesn't share the common liberal orthodoxy that we are all victims. If you're black, you're a victim. And I've often said to people, consider this, that you want me to believe that my children, who were born to two well-educated parents, who've always done well financially, who've never wanted for anything, who were not raised in the ghetto, who have had every privilege made available to them that their mother and I could make. You want us to believe that somehow our children are disadvantaged because of the color of their skin, and the little kid born maybe to an Appalachian mom who's gotten caught up on methamphetamines or on prescription drugs because she's lost out there, or maybe her husband's had a job taken away and he's given up on life. You want me to believe that that child is somehow advantaged and is a recipient and beneficiary of white privilege, and my children are somehow disadvantaged simply because of the color of their skin? I will never believe that. I will never accept that. The fact of the matter is, we've got to stop treating people like racial groups and start treating them like individuals, because every So I want to share with you just several propositions about how we move forward in this, how we deal with these problems. And the first one is going to shock you, but stick with me, because this is the first proposition. The first proposition is we must reject the idea that America has ever been a racist country. It has not. And I know some of you are looking at me right now thinking, what in the world is he talking about? I didn't say that there have never been racists in America. I didn't say that there's never been racism in America. What I've said is America has never been a racist country. Now, I used to practice law. I got delivered from that. But like a good lawyer, let me make my case. First of all, the premise of America being a racist nation always carries with it this idea that somehow the enslavement of black people and the racial ideology that goes with it was created in America. That is not true. It is not true. And I know this is not politically correct, and I hope the press will get this right. But it was actually Arab Muslims who were the first to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. They were the first. And by the way, it was Arab Muslims who were the first to create racial ideology, because they invented a word that was intended to convey being both a black African and a slave. The word is abid. It's been around for hundreds of years, and in fact, there are moderate Muslims who tell other Muslims they should never use that word because it is the equivalent of the N-word in Arabic. It was not Europeans who came up with racial ideology. It was Arab Muslims. It was not Europeans who started the African slave trade. The Portuguese were the first to engage in it, first Europeans, but they learned it from them. And by the way, it could not have happened without the cooperation of Africans. And that's what makes me remind people, it's not the skin, it's the sin. That's the issue. But Bishop, now, racial ideology did become a part of America. That is true. That is true. But we don't really understand how it did or why it did. When Africans were first brought here in 1619, weren't very many of them, but they were brought here to work. They were really indentured servants because there was no legal framework for slavery, and generational slavery did not yet exist. So they were brought here really as indentured servants, along with many Europeans, except that the Europeans were outnumbering the Africans. And they were doing a lot of the harder work because the Europeans, and this is, you can look this up for yourself, but they were considered to be pretty much worthless because you didn't have to pay for them. They came and had to work as a result of paying for their passage to get to the continent. But the Africans had been paid for and were valuable, and so the slave masters thought, well, if they're dangerous jobs, give it to the Europeans, because if one of them dies, it's no big deal. No, that's a fact. And in addition to that, the Europeans were to be rewarded after the period of indentured servitude with land, and since the landed gentry did not really want to give up land, the death of any European working for them was advantageous. Now, folks, these are just historical facts. Well, then what changed? What changed was a thing called Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, a white settler in Jamestown, who got tired of being mistreated by the landed gentry and fomented a rebellion that included not only poor whites, but Africans as well. 1,000 of them rose up against then Royal Governor William Berkeley and the House of Burgesses. They rose up, and they ran William Berkeley out of jail. Jamestown. He had to escape for his life. But ultimately, the British, of course, subdued them and brought them under control. And they realized something. We can't have these whites and blacks getting together. We've got to do something to prevent that. And that's when they began to develop racial ideology. We've got to convince these poor whites that even though they don't have what we elites have, that they're certainly better than these blacks. And that's when they began to come up with the slave codes. The slave codes. Established, the first one in 1705. New property interests in African slaves, that they were now to be deemed property. Free trade of slaves under the protection of the courts. That did not exist before. Separate courts to deal with slave matters as opposed to matters affecting white citizens. Oh, and by the way, you'll love this one. This is the first gun control law. All blacks, regardless of status, are not allowed to have guns. Liberals are still working on that now. And they added this: no white was allowed to be employed by a free black. No free black could hire a white. In other words, there had to be absolute separation between the races because they did not want them getting together demanding justice for one another. That was the beginning of the racial ideology. Now here's my point. Here's why I say America was never a racist country. Every time there was an effort to tighten the grip on black folks in America, it was because somebody stood up and said, what you're doing to them is not right. In other words, the racial ideology was a response to the efforts to give black folks their full human rights. And the same thing happened after the Great Awakening. After the Great Awakening, the fugitive slave laws and other laws that were put into place were the response to the fact that the Great Awakening caused a spiritual revival, and something called the immediacy movement began, where people began to say, we can't wait to end slavery. We can't wait to end it. It's got to end now. It's got to end now. And the more that was heard, the more the slave owners thought, we got to do something to respond to these Christians. And so then they began to develop a Christian theology, pseudo-theology, to justify slavery. Because they knew that if they didn't, these Christians would persuade people that this was wrong in the sight of God. And so they came up with this pseudo-nonsense to justify the institution. My point is, if America was so racist, why were so many objections being raised to the issue of slavery, such that those who supported it had to come up with justifications to keep it in place? Are you all with me? Yes. Now, the founding fathers lived in that historical context. Slavery was started 100 years before most of them were born. They were raised in it. They were taught it. We ought to be amazed that these brilliant men who were matriculated and enculturated into that institution, into that way of life, could rise above it and could condemn it and say, no, it's wrong. Something is not right. We can't do this. It's inconsistent with our values. Look, George Mason, the father of our Bill of Rights, said this during the Constitutional Convention. You won't hear this in public schools or in colleges. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. That's one of our founding fathers, the father of the Bill of Rights, condemning slavery during the Constitutional Convention. You won't hear that most places. My point is, America was never racist. There were racist forces in America, but there were also forces that were vehemently opposed to racism. And as a matter of fact, the Missouri Compromise was another one of those fights over whether we would allow Missouri in as a state, because they wanted to come in as a slave state. Will we allow this? The compromise was finally entered into. Okay, we'll allow Missouri in as a slave state, but we'll bring Maine in as a free state. And we'll set a parallel, the 3630 parallel, and everything north of that, no slavery. But the pressure never stopped. And so then there was the Compromise of 1850 around California, New Mexico, and then the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in which they said, well, we're going to let Kansas and Nebraska decide for themselves. And in 1854, pro-slavery and anti-slavery folks met in Kansas, and the Civil War had already started, because there were forces opposed to it from the very beginning. Now, you can choose to only acknowledge the forces that were pro-slavery and the forces that were trying to justify the subjugation of black folks, but I choose to focus on the Americans who stood against the institution from the very beginning, because they were there as the conscience of our nation. And if we're going to talk about the pro-slavery forces, then we better talk about the anti-slavery forces as well. And because they were there, I say my country was never a racist country. And I would end with this little symbolic occurrence. Preston Brooks showed up on the floor of the Senate because Charles Sumner had given a speech against slavery. And it said some things about his cousin, I think, a guy named Butler. It was a justification. He wanted to fight a duel with him, but people said he's not a gentleman, he's not worthy of a duel. And he walked up, and before the man knew what hit him, he began to beat him with a cane and beat him almost to death, because he dared speak passionately against slavery. Did you all know that there was actually an abolitionist movement in the South? That a woman by the name of Angelina Grimke left the South because she knew that she could not survive being against slavery, and went north to take a stand against an institution that she thought was evil? I mean, if you really want to be honest about our country, it's complicated. There's never been a moral consensus in America that black people were inferior or that black people should be subjugated. That has always been challenged. It was challenged first by the Quakers in the 1600s, and then challenged again and again and again by a whole variety of forces, including what came to be known as the abolitionist movement. My first proposition: America's not racist. We've got to stop teaching our children that. Let's teach them the reality of American history. Let's teach them that we're not a perfect country, but there were always forces for justice against those who thought it was okay to subjugate another people. Because that's the country I love. Not the country that has made mistakes and done wrong, but the country that also has people who have always said, no, let's get it right. Let's correct it. Let's make sure that we're treating every American citizen with decency and honor. Those forces have been there from the beginning, and that's what I want to celebrate about American history. Proposition number 2. There are people today who want us to be a racist country. And for exactly the same reason that pro-slavery forces did, to maintain the status and privilege that come with having a population of people who they can control and who are dependent upon them. See, America's never been a racist country, but there's always been racist forces, and they take various permutations. And I have to tell you, I'm not worried about the Ku Klux Klan. They're a bunch of idiots. Nobody pays any attention to them. And the neo-Nazis, I mean, everybody knows they're fools. I'm concerned about this subtle condescension that threatens to hold people in their place for the benefit of those who claim to be their their saviors. When I was about to apply to Harvard Law School, I had some professors, you all know my background, so please forgive me for saying this, but I want to put it in context. I was an A student in college, graduated summa cum laude. I went to my professors, I went to the University of Massachusetts, or as we like to call it, the People's Republic of Massachusetts. And I went to my professors as I was preparing to apply for law school, and I said, I want to go to Harvard Law School. My professor said this to me. I think I went to about 3 of them, and they all said the same thing. Well, that's nice. But you have to do well on the LSATs. And the LSATs are biased against black people. Black people don't do well on standardized tests. So I wouldn't get my hopes up about going to Harvard Law School. Now, I was raised by a proud American who happened to be a black man, and he had taught me, don't let anybody tell you what you can and cannot do. They tell you you can't, you just make up your mind, well, I will. So when they tell me you can't get elected from the United States Senate, from no office at all, watch me. Watch me. And I said, is that right? And they said, well, the culture's biased. Now, folks, my family dates back probably before this, but at least as far as 1798, I think I know the culture by now. And I did very, very well on the LSATs. And by the way, here again, just to put it in context, please don't take this as bragging, because I'm not bragging on myself, but on my country, on my dad, on the things that I think made it possible for me to do what I do. Not only did I get into Harvard Law School, I got into Yale, I got into Columbia, I got into whether it's good or bad or whatever. And the lawlessness of just tearing down monuments because they offend you. We can't do that. We can't do that. What we've got to do is talk to one another about these issues. Now look, I know I'm a member of the black community, so to speak. I just told you I'm a descendant of slaves. I'm not a fan of the Confederacy. You probably guessed that. Or a defender of it in any way. But I am a fan of American history. Yes. And I am a defender of our heritage as Americans. And I believe part of us understanding who we are is understanding the entirety of our history. I just said, there was an abolitionist movement in the South. I just explained to you how the racial ideology arose. But the problem has never really been race, has it? The problem has been the sinfulness of the human heart. That's the issue. Yes. Because, I don't know whether you're all aware of this, but before the British began to really get active in the African slave trade, some of you who are Irish in here know this. They were trying to make Irish their slaves. Yeah, people who looked like them, so to speak. See, so it's never about race. It's always about the human heart and the desire to exploit other people. And forgive me if there's anybody here who's offended by this, but I have to tell you, I only know one antidote to the problem of the sinfulness of the human heart, and his name is Jesus. I only know one answer to the unity this country so desperately needs, and that is the historic faith of our founding fathers that made us a country in the first place. Look, I don't want to have an official religion. I've been accused of, well, you want to create a theocracy. I do not. I do not. Because what would that look like? Would it be my denomination or your denomination or my church or your church? I don't want a theocracy. I don't want an official religion in America. But you have to be a fool to deny that America is culturally a Christian nation. That's who we are. And we should not try to take that away, because to me that is the key to our moving forward. That is the key to our future. That is the hope that we have that can bring us together. The fact that people sitting in predominantly black Jesus and reading the same Bible, and people in predominantly white churches are worshiping the same Jesus and reading the same Bible. If we can worship the same Jesus and read the same Bible, maybe we can come together and vote on the basis of our common Christian principles rather than focus on party and focus on race, but focus on the truth of the Word of God. So here's the last thing I would say to you. This is the last proposition. We have to have a vision for the future of our country. And some of what I'm going to say may shock you. Because here's the first thing I want to say about that. We have got to rid ourselves of the concepts of social justice and racial justice and focus on individual justice. Because that's the only true justice that there is. I know our Constitution recognizes protected classes that have been historically discriminated against. I understand that. But in the implementation of that, it is ultimately an individual matter, isn't it? I mean, you can't really apply broad, sweeping policies trying to capture an entire people. We tried that with the Great Society programs, and what did it get us? The perpetuation of poverty, the perpetuation of ghettos. We tried social justice and we built great housing complexes, and what did it get us? Concrete jungles. The reality is we have got to re-emphasize the importance of individual responsibility and personal responsibility, that no one can make your life better but you, and all we can do is try to move obstacles out of the way, but it's up to you as an individual to do something for yourself. We've got to change the culture of victimization to a culture of success. That's what got Candace Owens in such trouble, that she said, I don't want to be anybody's victim. I can stand on my own 2 feet. And you remember how Tom Arnold responded to that? Some of you may not be aware, but he tweeted out something so vile, I will not repeat it here. It was filthy, it was nasty, it was ugly. And if you ask, well, why in the world would he get that angry about what this little black girl said, speaking primarily to black people, saying, well, why would we want to be victims? Because she was messing with his status as a liberal savior. You see, the same way that the slave owner would have gotten upset by a slave running off the plantation, and you would think that they would say, well, of course they run, they want to be free. No, you know what they say? They would often say, why in the world would they run? They're treated so well here. And it's the same response. Frustration and anger because this young woman dares think for herself. We've got to stop the culture of victimization in our country across the board. Everybody's a victim now. We've got to focus on a culture of success. That's what made us the greatest nation on earth. Can you imagine the pioneers of our country coming here and whining about how rough it was? Wow, boy, the winters are really cold. Yeah, they sure are. I don't know what we're going to do about that. This doesn't seem fair. Or the fact that not all Indians were friendly, not all Native Americans were friendly. Some of them were hostile. And some of them actually committed horrible acts against the settlers who were coming. I mean, it went both ways, I know that. But they didn't sit around and whine about it. Can you imagine the young people, for you young people in the room, 17, 18, 19 years old, storming the beaches of Normandy saying, you know what, we need a safe space, don't we? You know, now one university said they're going to create a crime room as a prelude to your final. So before you take your final, you can go in there and cry. I mean, really? What is wrong with us? And some of this, they've even got some men into this. Men don't buy into that. as toxic masculinity. Just be a man. Just be a man. I told people, they say, now Bishop Jackson, you know, you've got to get in touch with your feminine side. And I tell them, I've got a feminine side. There she is, right there. And then we got to care about one another. You know, people may not believe this, but I look at people who I know vehemently disagree with me. Vehemently disagree with me. And sometimes I pray for them to weeping. Because I know that there's an eternal consequence to going the way they're going. And I want them to understand what I understand. I didn't just buy into religion, I bought into a person. I surrendered my life to the Savior of the universe, the Lord Jesus Christ. And I know He changed my life dramatically and permanently, eternally. I've often been criticized that I didn't support President Obama. And that as a black man, I should have. But I said, but as a Christian, I could not. I could not. But folks, I prayed for him to tears. Because I knew how important his role was to the future of this country. I never hated him, not for a moment. I know some people might have interpreted it that way when I said some things, but it wasn't hatred. Being a little too glib sometimes. But we can love people that we don't agree with. We can fight on the issues, but we can love them as our fellow Americans. I mean, if they want to be fellow Americans, I mean, some of them say the country's so bad they're leaving, they never seem to keep good on their promise, but nevertheless, if they want to be Americans, we can love them and we can try to persuade them, and that's what we want to do. We don't want to hurt people, we want to persuade people that what the ideas we have are for their benefit, they're for their good. We want to see people prosper and grow and become everything that God intended them to be. And here's one more. And I've got some booklets I'm going to pass out to you. We've got to solve the problem of inner city poverty and violence and disorder. We've got to solve that problem. And you know, I think liberals have proved that they can't. Because they've been in charge of the cities in our country for now 60 years, and they've done absolutely nothing but preside over the worsening of those circumstances. And I'll tell you something, I've got a program called Project Awakening. It is not a government program, but a private sector approach to dealing with the problems of the inner city. And it begins with cultural renewal, continues with an economic and entrepreneurial awakening, and closes with technical education that will give every young person an opportunity to earn a living right out of high school instead of feeling that the streets are the only opportunity they have to get by. Let's give them some real opportunity. If I become the next United States Senator, or some of my supporters say, when you become the next United States Senator, I'm going to file a resolution calling for September to be Celebrate American History Month. Because our young people have been lied to about our history, and it's about time we set the record straight. Because we're never going to get our country straight if our young people have been taught to hate America. We need to teach them why we love America. No, we're not a perfect country, but we're the greatest nation that's ever existed on the face of the earth. And finally, we've got to restore our fundamental faith in God, don't we? Because our problems are too vast and too great and too deep and too wide for us to solve them on our own. We can't. And the feelings are too sharp. Oh, I wish we could have prayed our way through the crisis that slavery precipitated, but we couldn't. Somehow we just couldn't get there. We couldn't find it. But I want us to pray our way through this. Pray our way through these differences that we now have, and they are sharp. Yes. They are profound. There are those who want the fundamental transformation of America, and there are those who want to restore the fundamentals that made America great in the first place. And I don't know that anything can cause those two sides to come together but God himself. I really believe that God was involved in the foundation of this nation. No, he didn't bring about a perfect nation. That was not possible because he had to deal with people. But he brought about the best thing that he could. And it's a nation that has blessed us, blessed our children, blessed the generations gone before us. And you know, I tell people all the time, look, I don't believe I'm here because of slavery. I believe I'm here because God ordained that I be here. And I'll tell you what, I'm sure glad that he did. Because I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. There's no place better on this earth to live. But our founding fathers said America doesn't work without God. Because they said freedom, true freedom, requires virtue. If you're not going to have an overweening government dictating to you what to say, what to think, how to live, where to go, where to work, that you need to have an internal compass that does that. And they all believed that God was the answer. John Adams said our Constitution was designed for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. George Washington said it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his promise, his promises, and to humble